Good afternoon. Welcome to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz from the Department of Communication here at Purdue Northwest. I want to thank our viewers for staying with us this season. This show is the last of the season. It's also the first of something Calumet Roundtable has not done before. We have normally had scholars, researchers, experts talking in an academic sense about things that aren't just academic. This will be the first time we've had two people that aren't expressly scholars, but they're experts in their own way. And it's also the first time we've had two guests that may have a slightly different take on the topic that we're talking about today. Today's topic is Black Lives Matter. My guest is Jamal Green, who's a community activist in Chicago, a member of Majostee Allstars. And my other guest is Glen Brooks, who's a coordinator for community relations for the Chicago Police Department. Just to give a quick background on Black Lives Matter, and either of you can correct me if I'm wrong, that organization that was formed in 2012, 2013, started out as a hashtag, social media response to the police shooting of the shooting of Trayvon Martin by a civilian, and then it was followed with an actual political action protest following the events in Ferguson with the shooting of Michael Brown, and from there it's become a national movement. And my first question to you, Jamal, is maybe just to talk about the relationship between some of the other community organizations in Chicago and Black Lives Matter, because it's not a centralized organization, but there's kind of a diverse group of people that participate in their activities.
Well, you know, I think Black Lives Matter has just been the overhead for any black community members to step out against the issues that are plaguing the community. I myself I'm not a part of Black Lives Matter, but it's more of a hashtag to everyone. Basically, when we're fighting, and when we're fighting for someone that was shot by police, we're saying, listen, we want black lives to matter, just as whites do, just as police officers, anyone else. You know, we want black lives to be equal. And so that's the purpose of Black Lives Matter. It's not an organization that I'm with or an organization that's anyone else may be with. But we're black people fighting for equality, and so you know that's what it is.
So when there's a protest or a demonstration, it's not under someone's authority, but it's easily understood as part of a Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, Black Lives Matter is something that the media. It's really something the media does. If you're black and fighting for justice or fighting for anything in the community, they automatically say Black Lives Matter. You know, because they want something to be attached to you. So it's something that the media does to us. We don't say it, or we don't say that we're a part of Black Lives Matter. We basically say what we're here for and what we're fighting for. So in Chicago, we're just fed up residents that are tired of the politicians, that are tired of the police killing us. And we're fighting back against that. You know, it's not Black Lives Matter, but we want us to be equal in our city.
Okay, maybe if I give some background to this, and we'll have Glen Brooks speak to it. There was a piece in the Chicago Tribune recently that said there's been 528 people shot by the police in the last 5 years. 92 were killed. 80% of the people shot were black citizens. If you're a black young man, you have 9 times the chance, statistically, of being shot by a police officer. What the Tribune said, it was brutal regularity that young black men are shot by the police. I just wonder how somebody that's talking about community affairs for the police responds to those charges, to those claim that there's a brutal regularity of the shooting of black men in Chicago.
You know, the Chicago Police Department, our goal is not to shoot anyone, and we regret the loss of life. That's not the goal of any of our officers. That's not the goal of the department. And those instances where force is necessary are they're always deadly force situations, and where someone has threatened the life of an officer or threatened the life of someone else, and the officer is forced to take action. This is not a targeted attack on anybody. This is a response to deadly force which is presented to our officers.
There was a report again in the Washington Post that said there's been 900 people killed by the police last year and 875 this year, and everybody from a 6-year-old to an 87-year-old woman. So, I mean, would you argue that in every instance where someone's been shot, there's been deadly force and the officer feared for their lives?
So what I would argue, and I wouldn't argue, I would say that, one, I can't speak to all those instances. Two,
well, I get, okay,
right,
but
but I
in
will
some
speak to
cases-
this. I will say this, that an officer has a responsibility to protect life and community. Now, if that officer, I will say also, all those shootings should be reviewed, and we should be held to a standard. And no one is saying that the police department or our members are going out and be able to use force without it being reviewed and held accountable. And there are a number of mechanisms in different jurisdictions, and they vary. But in our particular city, there is a mechanism which we review the officer's action, and when that officer is found to not to being compliant, there is some action taken. And if the action is found warranted, we state the reasons why.
Okay, that's admirable. I would, again, referring to the Chicago Tribune, they says there's been a systematic attempt by the police to not be forthcoming with information. So I guess, again, looking at both the Washington Post and the Tribune that give a lot more statistics than I could gather in a week, they said that there is, like I said, 80% of the people killed have been black youth. Kind of a regular brutality. One of the things that was noted when you look across the country, that Chicago has a much higher incidence of police shootings than others. So let me ask you this, is it because Chicago is a more violent community? Does Chicago have more people that confront police in a way that's not done the same way in New York or LA or Philadelphia? Why would Chicago, from the point of view of the community, have more incidents that where police feel that their lives are threatened? I'm not saying that it's justifiable. I'm simply saying factually, black officers are also killing black youth, which to me probably speaks more to the police department and to the culture of use of violence than the particular issue of race, although I could see that folded in. So I wanted to make that a point.
I understand, but I think race is a big issue. And we went into Mount Greenwood last month, a couple weeks ago. Mount Greenwood has 30% of police officers that live in that community. And we saw their family members come out, say, go home, go, you're animals, go back east, don't come over here, we're gonna lynch you. These are the things that their family members were saying to us in police search. You know, their husbands and their family members was working at the time as police officers protecting at the time we were in Mount Greenwood. So when you look at the mindset of those individuals in Mount Greenwood and know that 30% of the department lives there, what do you think the mindset of the police officers are who goes into these communities? You know, they feel like we're criminals. They feel like we're thugs. They feed into media propaganda. And so when they shoot a black teen, sometimes it's racial. Right now, we have an officer that shot 2 unarmed black men. How many times since you have the statistics in front of you, how many times white males get shot over black males? How many times? One thing I can say is that we have, in white neighborhoods, it's higher DUI crimes. And so how come a white male gets a little crazy, or if they pull over a white male that's drunk, or pull over a white male that's doing anything at a party or coming out of a bar, that deadly force is never used. And so a lot of times it is racially motivated.
I guess the question would be to you, Glenn. I think we have a few minutes before the break. If the statistics are true, if the black youth are being killed at a much higher rate than white youth or a white guy coming out of the bar, and even if it isn't a question of the white officer versus the black officer doing the fighting, what about the culture creates those conditions? Are you saying that Chicago's a dangerous place and this is just kind of what you have to expect?
What I'm saying is that our officers face dangerous situations. And in those situations, there are times when those become deadly force situations. When an individual despite their race.
Why would it be greater in Chicago than LA or New
I
York?
think one of the things that we are faced with challenge is that we have higher incidence of gun crimes. We have higher incidence where our officers encounter people with guns. So in
Does
that
that create a
sense,
mindset? I'm willing to accept that as valid. Does that create a mindset then of officers when they pull somebody over, because there are more incidents of guns, that their initial reaction is this person must have a gun, so you can shoot somebody
So,
that's
I
got a
think-
cell phone or
right.
a toy
So
gun
I
or
think there's a
something?
couple things that are going on. So we can't say, and we don't know that all these instances were a result of traffic stops. And I'm sure that they all were not a
Most
result.
of them are in response to domestic violence, but that's a
But-
separate
right.
question.
So, right. So, and it's that situation. If you're telling me most of those instances are domestic violence, what you're telling to me is that these officers are coming into situations which are already volatile, and they're responding to that situation. Now, what is, we not being able to speak to the specifics of each of those situations, and all we know from this context that they're walking into a violent situation, those officers are walking in, one, trying to mitigate the situation, and two, if they have to respond and take a police action, that is what they're doing.
Okay.
Despite whatever
Hold that
race
thought.
that
We
person
want
is.
to come back to talk about the police action and the response, but we have to take a quick break. This is Calumet Roundtable. We'll be right back. Hello, welcome back to Calumet Roundtable, the interview show that's produced right here at Purdue Northwest by the Department of Communication and our students. I'm your host, Lee Artz. My guests today are Jamal Green, who's from Majostee Allstars. He's a community activist in Chicago, addressing questions of police shootings and general racial inequality. And my other guest is Glen Brooks, who is a community relations coordinator for the Chicago Police Department. We started with Jamal before the break. Let's finish with you, or start this section with you. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about CAPS, what CAPS is and what its purpose is.
So CAPS is based upon the theory of the broken window theory, where you have communities that have social ills that rise to a criminal state. Whether it is a small thing such as abandoned cars, whether it's areas with large litter, whether it's areas that are missing social services, and those deficits add up to an environment where crime is more likely to occur. What we try to do is mitigate those and reduce it. And we do that through a number of different methods, whether it is a partnership, community partnerships, whether it's community organizing.
So does CAPS go around and repair the broken windows? Is that what you're
we don't per se repair the broken windows, but what we do is we'll try to bring our other city departments and agencies to bear on those problems, or we'll bring private partnerships in play.
This sounds good, and I know we've been talking about Chicago, but when you say that, it reminds me of a fact of life in the United States. We're one of the few countries in the world where the police are armed. And as a consequence, I think it plays directly into this, that the number of people that get shot as a result. The most recent statistics suggest that, they show that there have been 55 police shootings, deaths, killings in Britain in the last 24 years. There have been 66 police killings in the United States in the last 24 days. So it's part, Jamal, of what I was asking about before, that there's a certain culture that kind of may not encourage, may not even desire, but certainly the results have been many more police shootings. Yeah. So, I mean, is there another way to approach this rather than which may be justified protesting a particular killing, but moving more along the lines of what CAPS does, addressing the larger questions of employment, of education, of some security that's driven by the community as opposed to an outside armed force?
So we got to understand the model of policing that has been created in this country. But let me first say that the first model of policing in the 1820s that was implemented was slave catching patrols. And now we're living in situations where we're technically still enslaved, just not legally. And we're living in neighborhoods where there's no economic development. Unemployment rate is high all across the country. The school systems are underfunded. We have mental health clinics shut down, so it's no one to deal with the trauma. So we have so many different things that's going on in our communities that it just makes the police just that oppressive force that sits around and wait on something to happen. If you put 2 lions in a cage and starve them for a year, 9 times out of 10, they're going to turn on each other. And all you have is a police department that's coming into that cage ready to shoot the first person that gets antsy. So that's what we have here in the city of Chicago and around the country.
So if I can, real quick. So a couple things on your analogy with Britain. I think one thing that we aren't accounting for is Britain does not have 300 million guns amongst its citizens. The second thing we aren't accounting...
The guns are contribute to crime.
It changes their dynamics completely.
So are the Chicago police advocating gun reform?
Exactly.
So that
We absolutely are advocating gun reform. We have consistently called for common sense gun laws. We are consistently called for those who misuse the right to bear arms to have guns, who possess them illegal, use them illegally, should be held accountable. That is one of the huge differences between the United States and Britain. So you add in the factor that, number one, that we have an enormous amount of guns, nearly 1 for every citizen. 2, that the fact is that we have more murders. We have more violence in this country than we do in Britain. Those factors lead into situations where we have more armed confrontations. Now, to your other point, that the police are an outside force. The police are citizens of this city and of this state. They live here, they work here, they spend approximately 80 to 90% of their time within the corporate limits of the city. Some spend all 100%. That being said, we're not an opposing force. What we are is part of the community who's trying to serve the community.
I think I disagree with that. Let me first say that one thing he said was that almost 1 gun for every citizen. When the Constitution was put in place, I think that everybody has a right to bear arms. I think that the conditions of the neighborhoods, it's what's causing crime and causing police to respond. And so at the end of the day, how can you be police officers and advocate for gun reform when you guys have guns? And so, like I said, it always boils down to the economics of the communities. The problem isn't guns. It's the wrong people with guns. So we look at Dylan Roof, who walked into a church with a gun and shot a bunch of people because he was racist. You know, that was the wrong person to have a gun. And so at the end of the day, I don't think it's guns. I don't think we should go and take everyone's guns away. We need to fix the conditions of urban communities around the country. And that's what we need to do to go forward, to reduce crime, reduce police shootings as well.
it seems to me that we drifted back away from where I thought we were moving before our break, when a recognition that the police's job is primarily one of force. And that's primarily because there's...
So I'm going to disagree there. Okay. Because a police job isn't force. A policeman's job, every single police officer in the city of Chicago is a sworn peace officer, is to keep the peace. The fact that we can use force as a tool, and it's one of those tools of last resort,
Well,
It's
So
definitely not last resort.
no,
Definitely not.
those are, that is
first.
what the function of our police officers are. And yes, we are law enforcement officers. We are there to keep the peace through the enforcement of laws. That is what we do.
And I disagree. The gun is not the last resort, because 1 out of 5 officers were trained to use a taser. So how you don't have any other options to use but a gun. And still, now that they put a gun and a taser in every police officer's hand in Chicago, they still resort to using a gun because that's all they know.
Yeah, what I want us to think about is raising this above the level of police shooting or a particular incident, and I'd like us to think about the police as a function of a larger culture. I mean, one is what is crime and what is laws. 20% of the people in prison are for nonviolent drug offenses. There's 7,200 juveniles in prison that haven't broken any laws. We have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world, and right, for somebody that speaks that they want to be a patriotic American, how can you say, well, Americans are more criminally prone than the rest of society? Or are you going to say a particular section of this society is more criminally prone, which may, if
the
you
majority
believe
of people
that,
in jail.
the majority of people in jail, some 60% are black or Latino. But we have 2.5 million people in prison, which, if that's part of the result of law enforcement, which is part of the result of having these crimes be punishable by imprisonment, it seems it raises above the level of a particular police officer or a particular police department, because it's universal to the
universal.
country.
And not just not just people being in jail. That's not the only thing. You look at the overall culture. You got more black people in jail, more black people shot by police. You go into these neighborhoods, they're ghost towns. The mayor we have less than 20% of city resources going to urban communities in the city of Chicago. When it's time to build DePaul a new basketball arena, the mayor gave $100 million. When it's time to build high rises, the mayor gave $16.5 million out in TIP funds. When it's time to expand a school, it's $8.4 million. But if you look in those neighborhoods, they're boarded up houses, they're boarded up schools, they're boarded up businesses. Nothing is thriving in that neighborhood. No investment. So we're in this culture where all we know is that they're looking to kill us or put us in jail. They don't give us hope. They don't have give us good schools.
Here's a question for you, which may not seem fair, because I don't discount the righteousness or the justifiedness to protest if somebody's been shot, particularly shot, and it can be shown to be a crime, so I understand that. But I just wonder if there's another political approach, because you're talking about the communities. There happens to be a strike or a demonstration today at O'Hare where the employees are asking for an increase in pay. I know there's been demonstrations in the city, so I just wonder, although you're not with Black Lives Matter, I wonder if Majostee Allstars has participated in $15 an hour demonstrations, organizing people to be part of a labor movement that wins those kinds of things, because obviously relying on the mayor is not going to help.
It's not going to help. So I was a surrogate for Bernie Sanders, if you guys didn't know. And I traveled with Bernie to talk about all of these issues.
Bernie must not have been listening.
And, well, we talked about $15 minimum wage. We talked about universal health care and just being progressive as a country. I don't think that's going to happen with the current president. But, we have a lot of work to do as a country, but it matters locally. So nationally, a president can only do so much for those local towns and local cities, but we have to hold accountable our mayors, our aldermen. We have, 50 aldermen. We have 50 wards in Chicago where we have a person to represent each ward. We got a mayor, we got a governor, and all of these people aren't doing their job. And so that's why we have the most corruption in this state. We have the highest police shootings in this state, the highest crime rate in this state, is because we don't have leadership in this city to move us forward.
I was just, it's one man's opinion, but I was just suggesting that it may be the result of trying to focus on particular individuals, whether that happens to be a mayor or one particularly gun trigger-happy individual cop, which if they're guilty,
we need
he
people to
also,
listen to us.
also would. I just would I see at the same time, one of the things I noticed on Black Lives Matter, they put out a memo in solidarity with the Sioux Nation in North Dakota and the resistance to protect water rights there. And I noticed two things. One, veterans showed up on behalf of the Sioux Nation. The other thing I noticed is there were several police departments that refused to participate in the repression against those people that were trying to protect the water and their land. And so for me, it's kind of secondary to who's the president, and it has a lot more to do with what kind of appeals people make. And I just would suggest, I heard in the first part of our discussion here that there was a ground that we were approaching on what kind of world that we want to have, and I think that there's good intentions that can be tapped into.
Well, and I think it's important to note that one thing for the police department is, I know when people say, well, we're not peacekeepers, and it's kind of, looked, not really. But when we look at the protests in the city of Chicago, when we look at people expressing their rights, whether we agree with it, whether we disagree with it, we've been very successful at having peaceful protests and for people to be able to exercise their rights. We have not seen,
by arresting them.
We have not seen the same type of violence or destruction that we've seen in other cities.
And
we have kept the peace.
Those are leaders in the city that organize protests like myself. That are not the police department. We choose to do things peacefully and to hold politicians accountable. And we just have a different method in Chicago on how we deal with things. That has nothing to do with the police department. They have no control. And all they do when we go out and protest is wait for us to step in the street and arrest us.
Well, thank you, Jamel. Thank you, Glenn. I think we can end by understanding that peaceful protests come in response to conditions that people face in their lives, and that it's probably a necessary part of making some change to the conditions we find ourselves in. I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have on our program. Thank you, Jamel Green, and thank you, Glen Brooks, for joining me today on Calumet Roundtable. I'm Lee Artz, your host. Have a great day.